Hi, I'm Sean again, and I'm doing another video about the spine. This one is going to be more about the afferent pathways from the periphery and our actual sensors, our sensory organs, to the brain. And I'm going to talk more about it in the context of the spine here. But for about a minute here, I'm just going to go ahead and recap what I talked about last time with the general anatomy of the spine, including the longitudinal anatomy, the transverse anatomy, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the longitudinal anatomy, but in the context of specific sensory pathways that go up to the brain. So, last time I talked about this longitudinal view here. In the middle we have the spine, the actual spinal cord. You have the vertebral discs that surround the spine, but of the actual spine here, we have the medulla oblongata, which actually isn't the actual spine. This is actually the brain's part, the caudal part of the brain stem. This is the cervical part of the spinal cord, which has 8 segments in it. That 8 spinal nerves come out of it, or so. And the thoracic section that has 12 segments coming out, 12 spinal nerves, and then 5 come out of the lumbar part of the spine. Then there's the sacral part of the spine, and those exit through the sacral vertebra, and then we have the coccygeal section of the spine with 1 spinal nerve that exits through the near the coccyx, which is basically near the tailbone of the human vertebral spine, human spine. Okay, now these lateral organs here are the sympathetic chain ganglia, and that is where the sympathetic preganglionic neurons synapse with the postganglionic sympathetic neurons, and then those post-sympathetic neurons go out to the target organs. Sometimes the pre-sympathetic or the sympathetic preganglionic neurons go straight through and just go to the prevertebral ganglia, and prevertebral ganglia are just areas where the preganglionic sympathetic neurons synapse with other post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons, but they're just outside of the paravertebral ganglia, or also known as the sympathetic chain ganglia. So yeah, that's pretty much a recap of this part here. Moving on to the transverse plane here. We have the gray matter, the white matter. The white matter is myelinated and has ascending and descending tracts, and sometimes commissural fibers that go across from between the hemispheres. We have sensory information coming in to the spinal cord, and then we have afferent somatomotor and also visceral motor information leaving the afferent information. The visceral information, like I was talking about, the sympathetic chain ganglia. This is a sympathetic chain ganglion. We have sympathetic information going into it and synapsing with the post-ganglionic neurons and going out. This part here, last time I referred to as the gray ramus communicans, but it's actually the white ramus communicans, and because this is myelinated, and then the post-synaptic, the post-ganglionic sympathetic neuron that goes through and back into the spinal nerve. This part is actually the gray ramus communicans. Okay. I also mentioned that we have pseudo-unipolar neurons. So this is where the cell bodies are of those sensory neurons. So we have the part that receives the information from the end sensory organ, and then this part goes up to, in most cases, the medulla, in some cases the medulla, and synapses in those nuclei. But the cell body is actually here in the ventral root ganglion. These are multipolar neurons, and these are more representative among the actual motor neurons, because the upper motor neurons come down to the spine and then they synapse with other neurons, and eventually the lower motor neurons go out to your muscles or your smooth muscles, either your skeletal or your smooth muscles. And those lower motor neurons are multipolar, and actually also the upper motor neurons, the BETS cells, in the case of somatic motor neuroconduction, those are also multipolar. Okay, so moving down here, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ascending pathways in the brain. So, all ascending pathways have to start with a sensory organelle, or a sensory organ. So, we have different modes of information that your brain needs to know about your body. So, for example, one of them, like in these two cases here, the green and the light green, that would be somatosensory, mechanosensory information relating to either touch, like pressure, or related to vibration. So with pressure, like via your Merkel cells, for example, you have Merkel, maybe, there might be corpuscles, but when you put pressure on, say, your finger, for example, you can keep that pressure there and you keep feeling that pressure. Those are conducted through your Merkel cells, and that information comes from an organelle that when there's pressure or a change in the pressure, that it continuously sends a message that goes through your primary, your first order neuron, and goes up into the brain. And you can actually feel that in your conscious part of the cerebral cortex. There's other modes of touch information, though, that are more phasic information. Phasic means whenever there's a change, it causes stimulation. So examples of phasic stimulation would be vibration, for example. That's the biggest example. So say I run my finger across this board at some vibrational frequency, maybe probably above 30 hertz, I can still feel this. At a slower rate, if I put a little pressure on it, I can still feel the vibration. So at lower frequencies, up to around like 30 hertz or so, that's using your Meissner corpuscles, which is an organelle with kind of like myelin cells that surround some nerves, and those nerves send a signal that communicate the change in pressure. And whenever there's a change in pressure, it sends that signal. So that would be an example of phasic information that tells you that something is changing. Then you have your Passanian corpuscles, which sense a higher frequency, around like 2 to 300, or like 250 to 300 hertz. And that information is more for like smoother surfaces, like when you're moving your finger along a surface, or you're gripping something that's even smooth and you can still feel the slip of it, like in your fingers, you can feel where it is. When you move your hand, like using a tool, you're using your Passanian corpuscles. That information goes also through the touch pathway. Then there's also the Ruffini endings, which are in your, like especially in your fingers. Whenever you, like if I push down on this, I'm not just using my my Merkel cells, and maybe even, well, if I do it fast, maybe I'm using the Meissner and the Passanian corpuscles, but I'm using my my Ruffini corpuscles are feeling the stretch of the skin, because whenever the skin stretches or changes, they're actually sensing that. It's all over in your skin. So whenever your skin wrinkles and you feel it, some of that stimulation is coming from the Ruffini endings, is actually what they're called, not corpuscles, I'm sorry. Ruffini endings. So that's mechanosensory information that I talked about with those, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 organelles that actually convey mechanosensory information and touch and vibration and stretch. that you actually consciously feel like in your skin. So these green ones are conducting that information. So this right here is a spinal cord, that's also the spinal cord, but the upper one is conveying information from your upper limbs, and then the lower one here is conveying information from your lower limbs. And the reason I do this is because it's actually a little bit different each one, but I wasn't able to really show with proprioception the difference, but I'll talk about it anyway. So this pretty much here is the same thing as these here. Okay, so with mechanosensory information, you have that information coming in, coming up, and there's the dorsal root ganglion, which is where the cell body is. Remember, that's this cell body right here. It goes into the dorsal root ganglion, which is where your sensory information goes. And within the gray matter, this actually is divided into certain cytoarchitectonically defined regions. Like in your brain, you have Brodmann's areas, and there's like 52 of them. In the gray matter, there is 10 defined regions that change based upon cellular structure or like histology, but almost at the cellular level, they look a little bit different. So in the dorsal horn, you have 5 regions basically, and they're called Rexed's lamina, and they are actually enumerated using Roman numerals. So we have like 1 and then 2 and 3 and 4 and then 5 here. Okay, so for the mechanosensory information, when it goes in, there is a collateral axon, which means a branching axon, that goes into this gray matter here, and it hits lamina 1 and lamina 2 and lamina 5 when it goes in there. But the actual primary axon goes to what's called the posterior column here, also known as the dorsal column, which is your mechanosensory, your touch information. And that ascends up to the brain. So in this example, you can see it goes here. I'm not showing the collateral axon. It goes here and then it goes up. Now, if it's your limbs, like your lower limbs, like your legs, it's going towards the medial part. Later, like up the spine, like up in here, for example, it's going a little bit further out. It's more lateral because it's coming in later and it's going up. So this pathway, it stays on the same side. It remains ipsilateral until later. So it comes in, goes up. This is the medulla oblongata. So this would be this region up here. Okay. That green comes up and it goes up to in the case of your upper limbs, it goes to the cuneate nucleus up here. This fiber here in the lateral part of the dorsal medial lemniscus pathway, or the dorsal column here, is called the cuneate fasciculus. In the case of your lower limbs, which are more medial in the dorsal column, this is called the gracilis fasciculus, or fasciculus gracilis. The fasciculus gracilis goes up to the gracile nucleus, or the nucleus gracilis, whichever way you want to say it, and synapses. So this is one neuron that comes from whatever mechanosensory organ we have here, whether it be Merkel cells, Meissner corpuscles, Passinian corpuscles, or Ruffini endings. It goes in and goes up, and it synapses all the way up in your medulla. That is a really big neuron. That's a really long neuron, and it synapses in the gracile nucleus. Then from there, both the cuneate nucleus, the cuneate fasciculus, the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis, they synapse with their second order neurons, and those second order neurons go up to the thalamus. Initially, they are the internal arcuate fibers, and they decussate or decussate, whichever way you want to say it, but it comes from the number 10, so I think decussate is actually the correct term. but if you look at the spelling, it looks like a word that would mean something like how to make up with your spouse or your friend or your significant other after having an argument and cussing at them. Decussate. Anyway, that's not what it means though. It actually means to cross over, and the number 10 in Roman numerals is an X, so it crosses over like an X, So the cuneate nucleus, the gracilis nucleus, those cross over to the other side, the contralateral side, and they go up to the thalamus in the posterior ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus. And then from there, maybe some processing happens, or it just goes straight up, and then it goes into the internal capsule, and then up to the the corona radiata, and then up to the actual cerebral cortex in the primary somatosensory cortex. So in the case of this yellow one, this came from the legs or the lower limbs, this goes up, synapses, the second order neuron synapses here, then it goes up to the cerebral cortex and the third order neuron. In the case of the arms, this goes a little bit more laterally up into the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so that is the neurotransduction of mechanosensory information. Now looking at proprioceptive information, we have organs inside of our muscles that actually sense the stretch of our muscle. So right now my arm is extended. There are actually sensors, there are actually muscle fibers that are modified with sensory information that can tell how long my muscle is. And in these sensory organs, they have to actually have a muscle fiber inside of them that actually stretches to make sure there's no slack in the sensory organ. It has to stay exactly the same length as the muscle. So it contracts just enough to stay the same length as whatever the muscle is. And these muscle fibers, it's sensing the actual length of the muscle. So my brain is able to actually know where my arm is in space, and my cerebellum, which is this part here I'll talk about a little bit later, knows how far my arm is extended using these organs. And they're called muscle spindles, and they have a modified neuron that sends a signal to keep them stretched. It's a gamma neuron basically. So that information follows this purple path here. In the case of the legs, it actually goes in and it synapses at some other level in your spine, either the lower thoracic or the upper lumbar segments, in what's called Clark's nucleus. And that's actually just a part, basically it's this part of the gray matter on the ipsilateral side. It synapses there, and then it goes up, and also with your upper limbs, this purple area here shows an example. It also synapses in the gray matter too. Collateral segment does, the collateral branch does. But the primary segment goes up, and it synapses in the medulla oblongata and just lateral to the cuneate nucleus. It's called the accessory cuneate nucleus. So this is where that one synapses. It's a little bit different than the leg, but both of these neurons ascend and go up to the cerebellum. And so in the case of information that's going from your muscle to sense stretch, or even sense how much tension there is, that information does not actually have 3 orders of neurons. It actually only has 2, the primary and the secondary. The secondary synapses in your cerebellum, actually, in the kind of the medial part, actually. I think, if I remember right, is where it actually senses it, but I'm not 100% sure. It might be the paramedian part, but I'm not sure if I remember that exactly correctly. But they go up via at least the posterior spinocerebellar tract that goes through the back, goes up through the inferior cerebellar peduncles and goes into your cerebellum. And your cerebellum calculates how much stretch there is and where your arm is, and it takes information from this part of the brain that it's receiving and matches them up and decides how much the brain was wrong about what it thought to do like what it thought it was supposed to do. Maybe it didn't know exactly where your arm was in space, so it corrects that information and sends information down, which I'm not going to talk about, at least in this video. That's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about right now. So that's the proprioceptive pathway. Also, there's some conscious information that also follows the same trek, and also decussates and goes up to the primary somatosensory cortex. I think in like Brodmann's area 3A or something like that, and you're actually able to kind of know where your arms are in space. But I'm not sure how tonic it actually is. So maybe you could forget where your arms are in space, which is why there's all sorts of tricks to make a person feel like their arm, like they're floating, or their arms are like going through the ground. You know, if they stretch their arms for a certain amount of time, if they flex them and then they move them, they can like feel like they're in different places. I think it might be kind of more of a phasic than a tonic kind of signal that's sent. Now, moving on over to the spinothalamic tract, this conducts pain. So, and pain is actually pretty broad, because pain could be caused by heat, it could be caused by lactic acid, it could be caused by, let's think, acid, lactic acid, temperature, extreme pressure, even your itch. Like when you itch, that's also caused by maybe bradykinin or other kind of inflammatory kind of signaling molecules. Inflammation is another cause of pain. Like if you have a sore, you notice when you touch it, it hurts, you know, or even like right after you get injured, it kind of aches for a while. That is being caused by signaling mediators in the immune system that actually are causing that pain, like bradykinin, histamine, even serotonin. Like if you get bit by a bug, those kinds of things are causing chemical messages to go up. Or other examples are like angina, or I guess those are kind of mediated by the autonomic nervous system. Pressure, like your baroreceptors, when people feel pain, things like that, or lactate in your muscles, are sending a signal up, sending a signal up through the spinothalamic tract. That goes into, at first synapses right directly, the primary axon actually synapses directly into the gray matter. When it goes into the gray matter, then it synapses with Rex's lamina 1, 2, and 5. And 5 might cause deferred pain, like when you have a problem with like some kind of visceral element or visceral organ in your body. That information could get mixed with your other superficial parts of your body, and you can feel pain in a different part that's superficial instead of actually in the organ. That probably occurs in Rex's lamina 5, somewhere in here. But there's 1 and there's 2. 1 also integrates temperature, itch, cold, non-pain kind of stimuli also go through this pathway. This pathway is comprised of both first pain and second pain. So you're like when you first feel pain, you can feel where it is and you know exactly where you're feeling the pain. Then after like a second or less, you start to feel the other kind of ache that's a little bit more crude, like location-wise. You don't feel exactly where it is, but you feel the actual pain of that. That's conducted by C fibers. The actual pain that you feel, where you can tell where you're feeling it in the body precisely, that's conducted through what are called A delta cells that are actually myelinated and thick and conduct really fast. So this actually represents 2 different kinds of neurons. They actually synapse in different parts of the gray matter, but in both cases, they cross over, so they decussate immediately. So the second order neuron is already right here. Remember, the other ones were up in the medulla, started the medulla, or in the case of the proprioceptor, up in the medulla also. In this case, it actually starts right in the gray matter right away within 2 spinal segments of where it enters through the dorsolateral tract of Lesueur is what this is called here. So once it goes into the gray matter, it synapses, goes to the second order neuron, which goes up through the spinothalamic tract. There's actually two different tracts. One's more lateral and one's more anterior. So sometimes it's called the anterior lateral tract, but it's also called the spinothalamic tract because it goes from the spine up to the thalamus here, and then actually it also goes to other places. So first order, second order, it goes up, and it doesn't synapse in the medulla because remember it's the second order neuron started down in the gray matter. It just goes up straight up through the medulla and straight past the cerebellum up to the. It actually goes to the posterior medial part of the posterior ventral medial nuclei of the thalamus. Then from there, it's conducted up to a bunch of areas. In fact, even before it gets to the thalamus, it probably has collaterals that go to different areas, including the parabrachial nucleus, which is somewhere in this region, which would be like somewhere in here in the brain. It goes to the hypothalamus. It goes to the amygdala, which is where you feel fear. It goes to other areas like the periaqueductal gray matter, which can feel pain and react to pain and send endorphins and cannabinoids down to the spine to help you not feel the pain as much. And it also goes up to the cingulate cortex, which is the medial aspect of the brain, of the cerebral cortex, and also to the insula, which would be this part of the brain here. The posterior insula is where you actually feel like visceral feelings and stuff like that, and where you have a general feeling of how you actually feel about the world and things going on around you, even almost pre-emotionally or emotionally. Like you could possibly feel tingles here, where you can also feel pain here. Let's see, where else does it go? Yeah, that's pretty much it. But your actual conscious sensation, probably of the actual discriminative, like localizing of pain, probably goes up to the somatosensory cortex. After it goes to the posterior ventral medial nuclei, it goes up to the primary somatosensory cortex, and some of that goes to the secondary somatosensory cortex here, or somewhere in here, and you feel it in your insula as well. So that is pretty much a short discussion of afferent sensory neuroconduction from the periphery up to the brain. I'd like to talk more about this, but I don't have a lot of time, so maybe I'll talk about it in another video. I wanted to talk more about wind-up and about sensitization in the spine, which I could talk for like another minute about, I guess. Basically, when you have pain, it can go to some of the lamina here in the gray matter, and it actually causes a sensitization of pain, even if it's at a low frequency of pain, which is very odd in the central nervous system, because usually a low frequency of stimulation is going to cause long-term depression, but in the case of pain, it does not. It causes kind of like long-term potentiation. So you get a sore, if you touch it, it's more sensitive, right? Well, there's different ways that's mediated. It can be mediated through the gray matter inside the spine, and it can also be mediated locally around the wound. Also within the gray matter, there are signaling molecules like substance P that has retrotranscription